Inflation reaches its lowest point in several years as the stock market wobbles. The House of Representatives barely passes the government funding resolution and the SAVE Act. And the left's complaints reach record discordance. I'm Tony Kinnett from the Daily Signal's Tony Kinnett Cast, syndicated nationally at 7 p.m. Eastern. It is Friday, April 11th, 2025. This is the Daily Signal's top news in 10. U.S. inflation for March fell to an annual rate of 2.4%, lower than the expected 2.5%. This marks the first time since March of 2021 that the core CPI inflation, that's the Consumer Price Index, has dropped below 3%. Month-over-month consumer prices decreased by 0.1%. That's the first such decline since the onset of the COVID-19 era. The decrease in inflation was influenced by things like falling energy prices, particularly stable gasoline prices, along with reductions in prescription drug prices, airfare, used vehicles, and car insurance. While the Trump administration attributes these improvements to economic policies, critics over on the left argue that there is a distinction between controlling inflation and the actual levels of price. And then, of course, we need to take into account whether or not the tariffs on China and the 10% base tariff for non-reciprocal tariff nations, whether or not we're going to see that affect inflation in April. Speaking of China, the Trump administration held a cabinet meeting yesterday, and during this particular meeting, President Trump responded to a question about a couple of actions the communist Chinese government was taking to influence the United States in its trade war.
Mr. President, China retaliated today by reducing the number of American films that can be shown there. What's your reaction to them now targeting cultural exports from the United States?
I think I've heard of worse things. Yes, please.
The markets had a roller coaster of a day yesterday, up and down, the Dow finishing with a loss of 2.5%, down just over 1,000 points. The NASDAQ down 737 points, that's about 4.3%. And the S&P 500 down 188 points, about 3.4%. These particular fluctuations are largely due to the uncertainty on about two things. Number one, whether or not the Republican House of Representatives and the Senate were going to get their act together to pass the government funding resolution, as well as whether or not the Trump administration was going to negotiate any specific deals, zero for zero trade, for example, with other countries, as Scott Bessent has been talking about regarding the 70-plus nations who have come to the United States in one form or another to seek reprieve from the tariffs. Of course, given how close China and the United States have been in their import and export back and forth, there is a lot of uncertainty in the industrial and in the tech sectors as to how this escalating trade war between China and the United States is going to pan out in the long term. Regarding that budget resolution for fiscal year 2025, it passed the House with a vote of 216 in favor to 214 against. Now, these numbers are a little bit different than the continuing resolution for a couple of reasons. Whereas during the continuing resolution process, you saw one Democrat come over from Maine to vote in favor with the Republicans, while Representative Thomas Massie of Kentucky voted against from the Republican side. This time you had both Representative Victoria Spartz from Indiana and Representative Thomas Massie from the Republican side of the aisle vote against it. Two Democrat representatives did pass away between earlier resolution discussions and the passage of this bill, which Hakeem Jeffries made special mention of in a statement yesterday.
Passing this initial budget resolution should have been a slam dunk for Republicans. They had to pull the bill down off the floor last night and barely struggled to pass it today. We had two tragic deaths in the House Democratic Caucus. Had those deaths not occurred last month, Republicans could not have even passed the bill today.
Jeffries was criticized for what was described as using the deaths of the two former members of the Democratic side of the House as political props. That brings us over to the SAVE Act, the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. That passed the House yesterday with a vote of 220 in favor to 208 against. 4 House Democrats broke Hakeem Jeffries' ranks and joined all 216 Republicans to pass the election integrity measure. These 4 Democrats who sided with the GOP were Representative Jaron Golden of Maine, who was the one Democrat who voted for the continuing resolution back earlier this year. Also, Mary Gluesenkamp-Perez of Washington State, Henry Cuellar of Texas, and Ed Case of Hawaii. The SAVE Act requires individuals to provide documentary proof of U.S. citizenship when registering to vote in federal elections. Specifically, the bill prohibits states from accepting and processing an application to register to vote in a federal election unless the applicant presents documentary proof of U.S. citizenship. The bill specifies what documents are considered acceptable proof of U.S. citizenship, such as identification that complies with the Real ID Act of 2005 that indicates U.S. citizenship, something that is currently required in order to fly on a domestic flight here in the United States. Furthermore, the bill prohibits states from registering an individual to vote in a federal election unless, at the time the individual applies to register to vote, the individual provides documentary proof of U.S. citizenship, and it requires states to establish an alternative process under which an applicant may submit other or additional evidence to demonstrate their being a citizen of the United States. Lastly, states must remove non-citizens from their official lists of eligible voters. Democrats like Representative Becca Balint of Vermont tried to claim that if you got married and then you changed your name, then your ID wouldn't match the ID of your birth certificate. And therefore, if you don't have a passport and your ID doesn't match your birth certificate, that means you can't prove your citizenship according to the SAVE Act and you won't be able to vote. This isn't true. See, people in the United States have something called a social security number. And when you get married, you actually go through a process of alerting the Social Security Administration that your name has changed. And then they update records as necessary. And in all 50 states, even if you change your name due to a marriage or a divorce, there are processes in place in which you can show your identification and that your name has changed and that you are indeed who you say you are. Hillary Clinton tried to make the same case, suggesting 69 million women whose married names don't match their birth certificates were going to be disenfranchised. This is untrue. Sunny Hostin of The View went one step further and said that this was going to be especially hard on black women who, I guess, find it more difficult to get a hold of identification.
Don't have cars, don't have driver's licenses. So it's sort of a vestige of, I think, post-slavery laws where black people had to prove their right to vote. And oftentimes they couldn't vote because they couldn't pass some crazy test or they didn't have the appropriate ID. It also affects women that are married. Maybe your passport reflects something that's different on your birth certificate or on your driver's license. So really the bottom line is voter suppression. And I agree with him 100%. It's a brilliant notion that less voter ID laws allows more people to vote. And most democracies do it that way. We're the only ones that really don't do it that way.
Right.
On the left side of the aisle, the response to the Trump administration doesn't just stop with strange claims about the SAVE Act and whether or not women will be disenfranchised or what color women find it more difficult to gain access to identification. Chris Matthews over on MSNBC made a rather interesting claim about the United States no longer importing lumber.
But there's another thing. I watched on the evening news last night, one of the other networks, and I watched the issue of lumber. Now, you see, we get so much of our lumber, our 2x4s, from Canada. Where we get it from? Canada. We get our newsprint from up there for newspapers. The fact is we get it. What are we going to do? Have more lumber made in the United States now? What is our plan now? Oh, we're not going to import wood, so we're going to make more wood? We're going to create more wood? Is that it? I don't think we are in a position to simply replicate the imports coming into this country with our own products. It can't always be done. And I think if a wood's example of that, wood. Are we going to make more wood in this country because of our trade deal? I don't think so.
Although a particularly recent technological advancement, agriculture is the process in which one plants new plants in order to get more of those plants. We'll bring you more information about this breakthrough technology as more information becomes available. CNN advertised a major town hall for Democratic Senator from Vermont, Bernie Sanders, who's been going on tour with Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York around the country, preaching about fighting the oligarchy and the virtues of socialism. In this particular town hall, Sanders and Anderson Cooper, an anchor over on CNN, took a question from a young lady who then corrected Anderson Cooper on her pronouns.
Paul, we're back with Senator Bernie Sanders. I want to introduce Grace Thomas. She's a local civil rights attorney. She's a Democrat. Grace?
They, them pronouns, actually. Thank you.
Oh.
Good evening, Senator Sanders. Polling and turnout data indicate that men of all racial demographics are turning away from the Democratic Party. But of course,
the irony of asking Senator Sanders why individuals weren't flocking to join the Democratic Party while simultaneously correcting Sanders and Cooper on her pronouns was lost in the moment. Before you go, check the description to make sure you're subscribed to the Tony Kinnett Cast, and join us tonight at 7 p.m. for a more thorough look at the aviation accidents yesterday, both in Washington, D.C. with members of Congress on board, and the tragic situation in New York, as well as the Supreme Court's 9-0 ruling, which has me questioning the reading comprehension standards our public schools produce. I'm Tony Kinnett, and this has been the Daily Signal's Top News in 10. Take care.